So first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be in Moscow to visit your university. I'm very happy to be here. So today, as you can see from the title of my talk, I'm going to be talking about generative AI. And in particular, I would like to discuss with you some ethical implication concerning its application in society. So this talk is non-technical, today is Friday, we don't really need heavy stuff. So we can just talk easily about some of the problems that arise from the application of this technology in society. So, right, without further ado, let me get into the main business of this talk. Now, before I start, let me say that this is meant to be a dialogue rather than a monologue. So if you have any questions at any point in time, if you don't agree with something that I say, if you question something that I project here, just raise your hands, ask me questions, and we can go on. Yeah. So in other words, I don't mind being interrupted. Okay, so let's start with some introduction here. We are often told by experts that AI will contribute, as you can see, approximately 16 US trillion to the global economy by 2030. That's a staggering amount. 1/3 of the global wealth produced in the world yearly is believed that will be produced by AI by 2030. Specifically, experts tell us that AI will contribute to increase productivity and efficiency via automation, and will also improve decision-making processes in various domains, ranging from logistics and management to finance and marketing, or even in education. However, in the face of these many potential benefits that this AI revolution may bring about, some experts also warn us about some possible dangers concerning the application of this technology in society. For instance, in terms of undesirable consequences for the labor market, so more precisely job losses and increased precarity. In terms of exacerbation of social differences, the poor will get poorer, the richer will get richer, and therefore in terms of centralization, accumulation of power and wealth, which according to some may lead to the formation of a sort of a technocratic elite, which given this power and wealth would be able to control us, to control our lives. This is the perspective that is raised by, if you're familiar with Yanis Varoufakis' recent book, it's called Techno-Feudalism, or, it's also outlined in Surveillance Capitalism, which is a book written a few years ago by Zsuzsanna Zubov. She is in Harvard. Anyway, so there are different predictions out there about the impact of AI in society. Which one should we trust? How should we navigate the waters, the deep waters between these two predictions? One optimistic, one very pessimistic. So today, in this talk, I would like to...
Sure. No problem. In Zoom, listeners do not see your slides.
Yeah, sure. Please go. Yeah, I just... Okay, so today, taking this sort of general consideration about the impact of AI that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, I would like to explore with you the ramification of a subfield of AI, which is generative AI. In particular, I will try to review some of the specific benefits related to the application of this technology in society. This technology can indeed be beneficial, yeah? But as it often happens, this technology can also bring us about many problems. And so in this talk, I would like to discuss with you some of the dangers associated with the implementation of this technology. And so therefore discuss with you some sort of mechanisms, policy interventions that could be implemented in order to avoid, to mitigate the risks outlined in this previous part of the talk. And so I will discuss some mechanisms with you which involve politics, economics, which could be applied in order to safeguard our societies from the possible nefarious effect of this technology. And finally, I would like to finish up this talk by laying down the preliminary steps for the development of a framework, of a general theoretical framework, possibly philosophical framework, for, so to speak, the responsible application of generative AI tools in society, which is grounded in virtue ethics, so a particular philosophical theory. We will discuss about this later on. And so that is aimed essentially to preserve social stability and pursue moral good. So this is the, got stuck? Okay. So this is a brief general introduction about the gist of the talk. So now let's look at some of the benefits of this generative AI for society. Before we look at these benefits, let me briefly introduce the idea, its historical developments. So generative AI, pretty much like AI, had a number of ups and downs in the course of its history. Yeah? However, we can say that what was important for its development were two ideas, essentially. The introduction of Bayesian network causal analysis, which is a philosophical concept that was then applied to mathematics in the 70s and 80s, and the development, of course, of modern artificial neural networks, connectionist network, based on parallel distributed computing, the sort of work that you find in Rumelart, McClelland, Karmilov-Smith at the beginning of the 90s. However, it wasn't until 2014 with the advent of GANs, General Adversarial Network, which is a technique developed by Benjo, Goodfellow, and colleagues, that generative AI evolved to the point of making really impressive things, yeah, and opening up the possibility to develop the software that we have today. Software such as ChatGPT, GigaChat, the one that we have in China, Baidu, for instance, and so on, based on different techniques. We don't need to discuss them because it's too technical, but this is just an idea of what happened. So what are the benefits of this technology for society? Well, there are many. So, for instance, generative AI tool can be applied successfully in resource management and logistics. For instance, concerning resource management, it can improve customers' experience by integrating virtual assistants with online support. Every one of us has experienced this when we call our bank. The bot responds and redirect our queries to the relevant operator. So in this case, generative AI can better allocate resources. But it can also be applied in logistics, given its huge computational power. In fact, it can identify patterns in logistics operations that are often overlooked by humans, such as bottlenecks in supply chain and so on. It can not only identify this, but also suggest positive solutions. And yet, the application of generative AI are also found in finance. For instance, it can be used by banks to improve credit decision by carrying out what is known as predictive risk modeling analysis. So basically, a review of a customer, the reliability of a customer, and whether or not it is worth giving him or her a loan. But it can also be used in spotting anomalies in financial transaction patterns, thus helping detecting fraudulent activity. Or more generally, because of this computational power, it can be used in financial forecasting and investment analysis. And yet, there are more fields in which we can benefit from the application of this technology in society. For instance, marketing. In marketing, generative AI tools can produce optimized messages for specific niche, so to increase the selling of a certain product, for instance. And on a similar basis, they can be used. Generative AI tools can also be used for more noble goals, so to say. For instance, for suggesting certain lifestyles, which you may want to be, like adopt the lifestyle that is sustainable. Therefore, you use this tool to advocate for sustainability, for instance. Or they can also help in education, for instance, by creating training courses on leadership, or as you know, students can benefit a lot from these tools in writing their essays. Yeah. So all in all, we can say that the list of benefits in which this technology can be of use for us, for our society, is also left to our imagination. There are endless opportunities. So the point with which I would like to conclude this first section of the talk is the following. Generative AI can make relations between industries smoother and more fluid, so they can facilitate economic and social development. So far, so good. However, as it often happens with these revolutions, there are also some downsides. So generative AI also promised to automate many of our jobs, especially some of those that we thought were uniquely performable by humans, so creative jobs. There is a nice study that was published last year in the US, which demonstrates that, well, demonstrate is a big word, says that in the next 5 to 10 years, essentially many of those creative jobs that are listed in the slides, such as writer, journalism, web and financial analysts, web designers and financial analysts, will be replaced by the advent of these two. So this important observation, I think, should make us think about the prospect of the application of this technology in society, should make us reflect about its possible nefarious effects. Now, the intent, of course, is not to block technological development. We are not Luddite, but through reflection, we should achieve some principles for regulation that are oriented for the use of this technology for social harmony and, so to speak, moral good. Now, to return to the point, this is the overarching framework on which I would like to, get all to. But to return to this thesis about the impact of generative AI in society. When you talk about people, you often get two sorts of opinion. The first is those who uncritically embrace this revolution, who tell, in the past we have had many technological revolutions, the first, the second industrial revolution. The jobs that the technology destroyed were quickly, remade by the new technology. So we shouldn't really worry about this short-term job destruction, because new jobs will be created in the end. So this is one side of the debate. The other side, however, and I tend to subscribe to this view, says that, well, first of all, there seems to be a logical fallacy involved in this kind of reasoning, because you are projecting in the future what happened in the past. That's not necessarily, it does not necessarily follow. And second, there are important disanalogies between this kind of the revolution that we are enjoying now and previous technological revolutions. For instance, think about, on the first industrial revolution when they invented the train or steam engine. But the steam engine did not replace to cool the individual. It only contributed to enhance production. The individual was still required to produce the goods that the train was transporting. Nowadays, with the advent of this revolution, we are not only producing, improving the life of people, we are replacing people with machine. I've been working with Huawei when I was in Russia, and I was kind of scared by the fact that Huawei was working on a robot, chatbot, that will essentially replace the manager. So in agile methodologies, there is a figure of the manager that allocates tasks to software engineers. So Huawei is developing a program that will automatically replace the person, the manager, and automatically allocate these tasks to producers. So you see, there seems to be something more profound going on here, which is not analogous to previous industrial revolution. Now, this is not just my idea, luckily. A lot of scholars have argued, for instance, Björn Jolson, who is a Nordic sociologist who is based, I believe, in Stanford. Over the last 10 years, he has written many books and papers, two of which you can see in these slides, in which he has advocated that the major problem with this industrial revolution that we are experiencing, the new industrial revolution based on AI, is automation. Automation, according to him, has driven down wages and exacerbated inequality of wealth and income between those, he speaks in Marxist terms, who own the capital, so the technology, the know-how, the knowledge, the infrastructure, a very few elite, and those, the majority, that works for the capital. Yeah? And yet you may still think that this is some sort of, an old communist guy that lives in the past. And so we may disagree with him. But if you look at data, data seems to be supporting this speculation. In fact, there is a famous economist, Dana Acemoglu, who is based at MIT, who has written, again, many books in the last 5 years at least. One of these is the one that you see, in which he has provided evidence that algorithmic automation has contributed to slowing salary growth as well as to the worsening of social equality in the US. Specifically, he has demonstrated that between 50 and 70% of the growth in US wage inequality in the last 40 years was caused by automation. So here are some data that further support this view. This graph is taken from the Federal Reserve and indicates the distribution of wealth in the United States. The second graph is also taken, is an aggregation of data that aggregates data from the Federal Reserve, but is produced independently by another American institute, the Forensic Economic Services, which I think is now defunct, but it doesn't matter. So if you compare these two graphs, there are some small differences, but they tend to be very similar. Yeah, I personally trust more the last one because it's somehow independent, but it doesn't matter so much. What they tell us is three very important things. That first, 1% of the US population owed approximately 25% of the national wealth. 10% of the US population owes approximately 70% of the national wealth. And third, that this trend is dramatically increasing. You see the curve picking up in the last decade or so, arguably with the advent of the AI revolution. Now, leaving aside the geopolitical consideration that this may invite, these two graphs may invite, for instance, we are often told Russia is an oligarchy. Well, what is the US? Is it a plutocracy? Okay, so apart from this, what this graph depicts is a really, really problematic thing for our society. There is an unprecedented accentration of power, which in the years to come will threaten the functioning of our society, because people will get poorer and a few people will get a lot richer. And so they will have a lot of power over the rest of the people. And when people, as you know, get poor, problem start. Yeah. So if we want to avoid this situation in the future, so that there will be, which could threaten social stability, we should, I think, intervene now with a series of measures that are meant to revert this worrying trend, which I just try to illustrate. And so today with you, I would like to discuss two very simple interventions that are aimed at mitigating the problems that I just mentioned. They are accumulation of power due to AI automation. And I hope that these considerations I'm going to make will resonate with you as well. So first of all, before we look at these kind of policies or interventions, suggested proposed interventions, I would like to quickly show you this book, which is the sort of inspiration for this intervention. Yeah, so it's a book that was written by Diane Coyle, 2021, published by I think Princeton University Press. So it's a good book in which the author argues that in pursuing this new digitalization of our society, well, we shouldn't merely focus on numbers. Yeah, so we should measure technological advancement, of course, based on numbers, but trying to take into consideration other factors that are meant to bring about equality. Yeah, so pursuing a more egalitarian view in the development of this, in the implementation of this technology. And so what are these two interventions that I'm going to discuss? Both are concerned with generative AI. Now, they are very small intervention, of course, per se. They do not have a macroeconomic impact. Yeah? However, they are illustrative of a certain logic that, if applied across the board, across different domains, may bring about some macroeconomic impact. Yeah? So let's discuss, so bear this in mind. Yeah? because we don't have time to discuss more interventions. So these are the kind of paradigmatic ones. So let's take the production, one of the fields in which generative AI will have a major impact, journalism. So we know that in the next 5 to 10 years, journalists are likely to be replaced by these tools. The content will be produced by these tools. Now, in the field of journalism, there is a strong, very strong societal interest, that shouldn't be sacrificed for mere economic efficiency. So, in other words, in an ideal world, journalists should be, responsible for what they write. Right? We want customers to enjoy the most transparent, objective content possible. Yeah. So, in a sense, there is a need to protect consumers when they enjoy journalistic content. So to understand what I'm after, you may think about an analogy, food regulation. So in the food industry, there are very stringent mechanism, regulation that prescribes what manufacturers can and cannot produce in accordance to certain standards. If the manufacturer doesn't adhere to these standards, is excluded from the market, or it faces hefty fines. To be sure, no one tells how to produce a particular product, say a cheese, but we all want that the cheese that is put on the market is safe to eat. So in the same way, the production of journalistic content will be automated by these tools, will be made much cheaper. Yeah. However, we should ensure that the content that are produced by this tool should be, safe to eat. Now, when I say safe to eat, this is of course a very delicate issue. There should be some sort of mechanism developed internationally to kind of regulate this. If you think about, so think about an example, the EU Service Act. I don't know if you read it recently. Any one of you has read it? No? So you read it. So what do you think about it? Is it a form of protecting the consumers or not? I think it claims to be a form of protecting the consumers, but it ends up being a form of censorship. Yeah. So what I'm saying is that we don't want that kind of approach. Yeah. We want an approach where ideally the institutions are really are benevolent. Yeah. Not malicious. So this should be. Of course, I realize this is very difficult to achieve, but this is the idea. So, yeah? So now, of course, you may say, okay, this is just an idealistic aspiration. Yes, but idealistic aspiration conflate with reality. And so often idealism move forwards reality. So in the battle between realism and idealism can function as an engine for development. Yeah, so we shouldn't disregard this consideration simply as being idealistic and therefore not relevant. They can be relevant. Yeah, why not? So what's the intervention that we could propose in order to be sure that the content produced by these tools are effectively directed at protecting consumers? Well, reintroduce humans in the loop. So rehire people, that qualified people, possibly independent of any government or institution, in order to check the content produced by these tools. So this type of activity will somehow protect the customers, but will also have some sort of microeconomic impact, because a lot more people will be needed to check the content produced by this tool. So on the one hand, we face brute automation, which will cancel off the job of these people. On the other hand, we hire people. We can hire people to retrospectively check this content. So we can partially offset and compensate the drawbacks of brute automation. So this is just an example that could be done across different domains. Another example, I think, is the following. So generative AI tool, for all the investment that private companies are putting in it, especially, in terms of personalization. Think about Bill Gates, Altman. They want to create a new tool, basically embodied AI agent, that can function as a recommender system. So, and therefore can give you insight about what product to buy at the most convenient time, for instance. So because of all this investment, we face the following scenario. We face the adoption of this technology for in daily life. And what this will mean, that this will mean that this technology will likely become the technology that all people will be using to make their decisions. So this is a very dangerous thing for a number of reasons. The first reason is that these tools are neither, are not neutral and they're not opaque. Yeah. So the information on which the algorithm on which they are trained are mathematically opaque. So they cannot be transparent. And they're not neutral because the information that they produce is always determined by the data set on which this model trained. And the data set is, of course, programmed by the owner of the infrastructure. Yeah. So, for example, I'm not sure if you ever tried this to question ChatGPT, but you can try it, and you will see that there have been a lot of studies, for instance, that have demonstrated this point that ChatGPT is not really neutral, despite what it claims. It's not really neutral because it tends to favor democratic over Republican views. Now, I personally don't care about democratic or Republican views, but it's just a point. Yeah. So these tools are far from being neutral. And so, because they're far from being neutral, what we need is to encourage the development of some pluralism of view, but not for some crazy idea, vague idea of democracy, whatever it might mean. It doesn't mean anything, but for very tangible needs. For instance, on the international arena, it will help, avoiding the risk associated with homogenization related to one particular language. English, for instance, yeah? And this is why Russia, China, major power are developing their own large language model, GigaChat, how is it called in Chinese? Ernst Bernie, whatever. So this is very important, but it's yet not enough because, how many tools can we create? There are not many superpower in the world that can create alternative generative AI tools. So another suggestion would be to try to maximize within the nation the production of different tools with different standpoints. So this will necessarily drive towards the production of more software. And so if you need more software, you would have to hire more engineers. And so this could be a way of promoting some sort of economic development. Now, naturally, you may object that in this process, companies who entered the market very early on will have a dominant position, and they would be reluctant to give up this dominant position. They will have the best engineer, they will have the best knowledge, they will have the more money, and so they are unlikely to allow this competition, national competition. So it is here that I believe that the government should enter the scene, and so kind of allocate public investments so as to foster the development of new companies that could take on these monopolies or oligopolies formed within the private market, by the private market. So in brief, what I'm after is the work of one famous economist. Her name was Elinor Ostrom. She was the first woman to get the Nobel Prize in economy. And she wrote this very nice book in the 90s, at a particularly troublesome time, where she tried to advocate for a decentralized system of governance, which would revolve around people, so in which people take control of the resources collectively, but this model was drawing from two of the models that were fighting at that particular time, so socialism and capitalism, and without ending up being neither of them. Yeah, so it's a sort of a neutral model which advocated for essentially the centralization, the governing of resources by the people more directly. Yeah. So what we could do perhaps is to take this model, replicate this model in AI governance. Yeah. And so a commons approach to AI would probably require governments or societies in more general to invest in public infrastructure and to develop mechanisms to support such a decentralized model of development that would be focused on value creation rather than on value extraction. So a model that would be very different from the one we have experienced in the last 10, 20 years, where the private which is based, of course, on US capitalism, where value extraction has taken priority over value creation. Yeah. So now, naturally, this is a very idealistic thing to advocate for, and it's unlikely to be received under current circumstances. So what we should do, I think, is to demand the development of a new regime for the regulation of AI in terms of governance, control, and ownership. And so here follows a series of suggestions that I think are reasonable, that should be implemented in order to revert the current trend that I try to explain in the previous part of this talk, the accumulation of power in the hand of few people, of few companies. First, I think there is a need to develop antitrust laws that could be used to mitigate the power of these big high-tech companies. Of course, this is not only a point that applies to AI, it applies to large conglomerates, pharmaceutical companies, civil aviation companies, car manufacturers to some extent, but it's particularly relevant to AI, given the concentration of resources that AI is enjoying, and given the prospects in terms of impact that this this AI company will have on our economies in the future. So in brief, I think it is unacceptable that private companies can sit down with a prime minister of a president of a country. Maybe it doesn't happen with big subject countries such as Russia, China, and the US, but it certainly happened, I can guarantee you, with even with mid-sized European powers, even my own country. So I think this is unacceptable and should be changed. Another thing that should be done, I think, related to this is the nationalization of key technological infrastructure. So the idea, of course, is not to recreate some Soviet-style quinquennial plan, complete control of the government over society. I think we don't want that. I don't want that personally, but we do. So we want the market to flourish and thrive, but within certain very strict regulations. So the idea is that the government should intervene to supervise the markets with powerful ends, so as to avoid this concentration of power, accumulation of power. In other words, to allow a company to pursue a profit, but a profit which we may call moral somehow. Now you may hear say, okay, this is another communist idea or whatever. We know that the private does better than the public in managing resources. Well, I tend to disagree with this. The private does better than the public at the very beginning. When there is an initial output and the resources are privatized, then the consumers enjoys better deals. But then, as the market crystallizes, as everyone that has experienced it, take the train now in London, it will cost to go to just the outside of London 30 pounds. Yeah, this is due because the market has been privatized. Yeah. Another example, which may resonate with you. Take military. So Russian military and US military are the two largest military in the world. Take, I don't know, nuclear submarines. So nuclear submarines, Russia fields the Borea class. Borea class is very advanced. It costs around 900 million each in US dollars. The next comparable thing that the US can field is the Virginia class. Virginia class costs 2.5 million each, and it's inferior in terms of armament, for instance. So they plan to procure a new class of submarine, which is called Columbia class, by 2030. This Columbia class will cost between 8 and 9 billion each. So that's a staggering 10 times more than Russia's Boreas class. So, of course, there are certain specificity in the Russian economy that allow Russia to produce these submarines at a cheaper cost in the United States. But the most important reason is that in Russia, the state owns the military companies, the military sector. Whereas instead in the United States, the military sector is owned by 4 or 5 private companies. And this is an example of how the private tends to maximize profit irrespective of societal needs. And so this is the idea that I think we should kind of implement. But then, of course, allowing the state to control so much resources might be problematic. And so this is where I think we need to go back to Ostrom's view on the common, and so foster the development of some sort of decentralized mechanisms for governance that allow people to more directly manage the resources. So, for instance, what could we do? For instance, develop more educational reforms that could bring the gap, bring down the gap, reduce the gap between rich and poor, between educated and uneducated, for instance. Develop some sort of international agreement to make the generative AI a sort of common heritage under some sort of chart, not necessarily the UN, because the UN is far from being neutral, but a new organization that could be developed, could take account the needs of everyone in the world. And so that there is more accessibility to this technology, irrespective of where you are. But we also need more participation, and therefore we need more participation of community of people and workers to be involved in the development and regulation of this technology. So again, do not take the EU Service Act as the kind of point of reference. That's the opposite that I want. Okay, so these are just some ideas for trying to revert this trend. Now, maybe we want to look a bit more from a more general perspective, philosophical perspective, of what could be a framework, an ideal framework for carrying out this sort of ambitious, idealistic revolution. And so I think a framework that that can come in handy and comes from philosophy is a framework that is revolved and is based around what is known as virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is has a very long history. It dates back to Aristotle, the Stoics. It has also found its way in China with Lao Tzu. So it is essentially an approach where there are certain characteristic traits that are known as virtues, paradigmatics, that are acquired through practice and habituation, and are not universally determined in a non-pluralistic and culturally insensitive way. So they're not normative. Now, here maybe we need to say a little bit more, because I'm not familiar if you're, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this kind of approaches. So, in general, in philosophy, we can say there are three major views of ethics. There is what is known as deontological ethics, which is based on Kant. So it's found mostly in the continental tradition. And it's been applied also in kind of the Anglo-Saxon world with the work of John Rawls, for instance, but it's not mainstream in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's mostly found in continental Europe, Germany, Italy, and France. And so this approach says that there are universal principles, that apply across all culture. So you cannot derogate from this principle. This is based on the idea of a categorical imperative. And this, by the way, explains the very funny, peculiar characteristics of Anglo-Saxon to always go and teach, to Protestant, to always go and teach people how to live. Because this is also known as Protestant ethics. Yeah. So, for instance, do not kill, do not steal. These are universal principles that you cannot derogate. Apply across all cultures, they say. So, for instance, lying is bad, and no matter what consequences lying brings about, it's always bad. It should be avoided. Then there is utilitarianist approach, which is part of consequentialism. This is found mostly in the Anglo-Saxon world in the work of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So utilitarianism says, no, there are no universal laws, there are no innate rules for morality. What makes an action moral is based on the consequences that it brings about. The better consequences for the greatest people, then the better the morality of that action is. Yeah. And finally, there is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is somehow similar to deontological ethics in the sense that it postulates the existence of some paradigmatic virtues out there, but it doesn't believe that these virtues are phylogenetically inherited. Rather, it believes that they're ontologically learned. So they are contextually acquired through practice and compromise. Yeah. And so, yes, lying is not bad per se, but it would be bad in a particular circumstance in which it goes against some sort of moral of paradigmatic virtue. For instance, being honest with people. Yeah. So each of these approaches has limitations. For instance, deontological ethics, the major limitation of deontological ethics is that it's very rigid. Yeah, it's unlikely to be successful in society because society is not black and white. You know, it's very difficult. It works on the assumption that it must be absolutely honest, which is almost impossible to realize. Utilitarianism seems like a good option, but it runs into problems with respect to the minority. Not always what is good for the greatest people is also acceptable. Let's put it in this term for a minority. So utilitarianism risks putting at discrimination certain minorities. So it's a famous paradox about utilitarianism. And finally, virtue ethics, because it's related to, you know, ontological development, is often accused of being too much relativistic. Yeah. So each of these approaches have problems. But I believe the most promising of these three is virtue ethics. And actually, most of the work in philosophy of artificial intelligence has been done in respect to the ontological and utilitarian ethics. Virtue ethics is only now coming up as an alternative to model an approach to artificial intelligence. And so I believe that embracing this approach that I outline now, based on virtue ethics, would be akin to the sort of inspiration that comes from the work of Elinor Ostrom that I mentioned before, because it will allow the development of some sort of social empowerment that is not going to be fixed and centered around two major ends, either the state or the company, but it will revolve around the people. Yeah, and so this can help developing the technology while preserving, while maintaining human agency. So the control of humans and the regulation of this technology. And an additional benefit would be that by incorporating this sort of paradigmatic virtues that virtue ethics postulates into artificial intelligence system, well, we can make this system better aligned with our needs and expectation, therefore allowing them to kind of foster more profitable collaboration with humans. However, I don't think that this would be enough. For the realization of this idea, we should also be sure that we implement a sort of meta principle, a principle of meta responsibility that will feed up on this idea of virtue ethics. Yeah? And so this meta responsibility would be crucial to keep in check the actors by developing a distributed view, a distributed sense of what is good to do. Yeah. So basically, I believe these two requirements. One is the virtue ethics approach implemented on this notion of meta, complemented by this notion of meta responsibility, could help creating synergies between humans and AI systems that can bring about, first of all, responsibility on the usage of these tools, and second, guaranteeing some sort of morality in their usage. So, for instance, with respect to reduction of inequalities, or what I mentioned before as the pursuit of some sort of moral profit. And so this is what I wanted to, sorry, it doesn't go, tell you today. These are some of the references that I mentioned in the talk. You may check them if you like. And so with this, I'm going to stop here, and I hope it wasn't too long for a Friday night. So thank you.